if you think that you've had fun so far, now we're going to open up for questions. So I'm going to look through any of the questions that are written down on index cards. But you can also ask any general or specific questions of myself or any of the panelists directly.
Massimo, with your perspective as an evolutionary biologist, maybe you can help us here. I don't see how a Marxist solution is possible, how we get there. What's the evolutionary path that gets us back to Marxism in a global economy?
I suspect you're going to have some disagreement here. First of all, I don't necessarily think that we should look for evolutionary paths in order to move society. Evolution is what explains how we got to the basic level of being a social animal that reacts in a certain ways to certain kinds of environmental conditions. But then beyond that, we got cultural evolution. Now, cultural evolution is also a form of evolution, of course, but it's very different from biologically based genetic evolution. So I wouldn't look necessarily to biology for an answer to what's going to happen in the future and how we're going to get there. However, I suspect, contrary to my colleagues, that is one of the reasons I'm so skeptical about the Marxist solution. In fact, I'm equally skeptical of the Marxist and the capitalist solutions, at least in their extreme versions. And the reason for that is because they both make the same mistake in opposite ways. That is, they dramatically underestimate human nature. Now, I understand, of course, that the concept of human nature itself is controversial. We could have a whole other evening about just talking about that. But bear with me for a second. I think that if there is anything about human beings that we know of, is that we are social primates, as I said earlier. Well, being a social primate means that you essentially are bound to have two contrasting instincts. One is the instinct to do things to your own advantage or the advantage of your kin relatives. That's because that's what biology tells you to do. Your genes are going to be passed on by your offspring or very close relatives to you. So there is a strong instinct to essentially behave selfishly. I'm not talking about this selfish gene. I'm talking about selfish individualism. At the same time, however, we are in fact social primates, not just primates, and so there is also a strong, again, fundamental biological instinct toward cooperation, because that's the way human beings got away with surviving for so long over the last, several hundred thousand or million years or so. So the idea is that the way I see it, the fundamentals of human nature is that we have a constant struggle and therefore a constant balance between selfish interests and cooperative interests. And where I see the problem with sort of extreme versions of political systems is that they often try to play only to the cooperative and basically try to ignore the selfish instincts, or only to the selfish instincts and then try to ignore the cooperative instincts. And that's a recipe for disaster. If you try to get somewhere that bluntly ignores the fundamentals of human nature, I don't think you're going to get anywhere.
Matt, can we comment on each other's comments?
Sure.
Okay, good. And I don't want to take too much time because I really want to get as many questions from the floor as we can. Massimo, let me try to give a sort of, perhaps a basis for a little bit more optimism here. The fact is that even if you suggest that there is a human nature which has evolved over time through the process of evolution, the fact remains that we now live in a society where the development of the productive forces is such that we can no longer think of the evolutionary process as simply an act of nature devoid of intention. We are little by little becoming so knowledgeable about the way that process works that we ourselves will gradually begin to profoundly affect, in a conscious way, the way that process will continue. So my suggestion to you is that when somebody says that, in the final analysis, the morality that you have is the morality that comes as a result of the development of the level of productive forces, it's not that we're denying that there's a biological basis that we're working off of. What we're denying is that the biological basis is actually any is actually an independent, right, process any longer. It is now a deep, in other words, nature has been humanized. The fact is, it's now up to us what happens. We now have the capacity, I mean, that's the whole point behind the ecological movement. We have the capacity to destroy or to preserve. And when we preserve, also to change, and change in a direction that we think is emancipatory. And so I really don't think there's any conflict here, as long as you understand the dual nature of what's taking place, and maybe that's a bit more grounds for optimism.
Okay, I'm going to jump in too, which is, I guess I think that in terms of human nature, Marx made a point that all of human history is a transformation of human nature. It's in different conditions, what it has meant to be human. There's obviously a biological substrate, and there's people here who know a lot more about that than myself, but that one of the things that makes us human is our tremendous amount of plasticity and ability to adapt to different environments and to be socially conditioned. But I think the thing that has to be understood is that in every era, then those social productive forces, the base of the economy and society gets codified, and there's a state that enforces that way. So this is where I have a difference with the balance, between the not extreme capitalism and not extreme communism, a balance of the selfish and the social. You're going to have you're going to have an economy that is either based on, in this era, socialized production. 6 billion people on the planet. We're going to meet our needs either through massive socialized production that is privately appropriated, and then that gets backed up with force. And you have things like Katrina, where private property was protected instead of human life. Or you're going to have an economy, a revolution, and a revolutionary state power that gives initiative and precedence to meeting the most fundamental needs of humanity through those socialized networks of production and socialized distribution. And then in that context, you have a lot of, again, continual transformation of what it means to be human, what seems natural in one era. It starts to change. And it doesn't mean we're going to be able to, that we won't still mourn or we won't still have joy. There are things that make us human, but the content of that and the way that we're organized is actually not, it's principally determined by society at large and not by this is where I would agree, it's not just our biologies dictating this. In this era, we are, people, and I use the example of Katrina, I'll end with this, is that you really saw in that the capacity for people to act on a higher interest, on that social interest in a very vivid way. People, if you see that movie, Trouble the Waters, which is a great documentary of somebody who was caught in the floodwaters, they showed people who were gangbangers the day before, who this system forces them to compete for a corner and for a chance to sell drugs and go to jail and die young. And they showed them going and risking their lives and stealing a punching bag when there's shoot-to-kill orders out on them, stealing a punching bag and then floating around in the toxic floodwaters and rescuing people they were in rival gangs with the day before. And then that was repressed. That was blotted out. That was criminalized. And the same thing, when Sean Penn and other people went down to volunteer, they got their boats and they tried to get in, that was repressed and criminalized. You actually have a state that enforces the domination and the initiative of and an economy that forces people to compete with each other to survive. And that's what gives rise to the notions in this era that everybody's principally selfish and out for themselves, because this society forces you to be. And if you had a different society and a different state power and ultimately the achievement of communism, the sharing of the abundance of the planet, that would change too.